today's video, we're going to be looking at a lens by Lomography, but what makes this lens different is that it's based on an old vintage design, the Petzval. But before we jump too far ahead, I need to talk briefly about the history of lens design. Photography, in essence, went public in 1839 with a few notable names, including Nicéphore Niepce, Louis Daguerre, and Fox Talbot. And it was during this time where these very simplistic lenses were basically just being designed on experimentation, experience, and trial and error. Though shortly afterwards, Louis Daguerre worked together with a gentleman by the name of Charles Chevalier, an optician and instrument maker in Paris, where they actually ended up creating an achromat lens consisting of two cemented glass elements able to correct for chromatic aberrations. Though these lenses did end up having apertures of around f/17, not particularly ideal for portrait use, and with emulsions of the time, exposures could end up being about 10 minutes or more, even in broad daylight. However, Chevalier was eventually able to design a lens with an aperture of f/5.6, though the one downside of his design was that it suffered from sharpness across the whole field of view. Also during this time, Joseph Petzval, a mathematician at Vienna University, also decided to give it a go. The lens design itself consisted of 4 glass elements, the front achromat with 2 elements cemented together, similar to other earlier designs, and 2 rear elements with an air gap between them, and a native f/3.6 aperture in the middle. Though what made his approach unique was that he was the first person to design a lens based completely on mathematical equations, and with his design was able to drastically reduce exposure times. Even though the design allowed for faster lenses, this did create some unique visual properties, with the lens itself being sharpest in the centre and drastically falling off towards the edges and including heavy vignetting. Though because these lenses were being targeted towards portraits, those kind of characteristics often actually helped focus the viewer to the model in the photo. With that, Petzval became an instant success and practically gave birth to commercial photography. Though because the design was never patented, however, there were many versions rebranded under different companies, with one of the first being Voigtlander & Sons, who'd worked closely alongside Petzval designing it. With so many companies producing similar lenses, other design aspects were introduced. One of these additions was the ability to allow variable apertures. A gentleman by the name of John Waterhouse came up with the idea of inserting stops via a slit in the top of the barrel, allowing you to change the f-value of the lens, which is why these are called Waterhouse stops. Another change added was a fine-tuned focus mechanism utilising a rack and pinion method to move the elements back and forth. But what has Lomography got to do with this story? Well, if you've ever been interested in kind of trying one of these old vintage lenses, it's likely that you'll have to repurpose it for large format cameras. However, in 2013, Lomography successfully funded a Kickstarter for a Petzval inspired lens for modern SLR cameras. The Kickstarter was so successful that several other vintage inspired lenses were released at a later date. Unfortunately, I don't have any of the newer ones, though the one I do have is from the original Kickstarter. The lens itself is an 85mm f2.2 with a fully brass housing. As with older designs, the aperture is adjusted with the supplied Waterhouse stops and focus is adjusted with a knob on the side. If I remember, the original Kickstarter only offered lenses in 2 mounts, Canon EF and Nikon F mount, which is what I have here. And with that, I think it's time to make some images. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a model to take portraits with the lens, so instead I've come to a quiet wooded area, and during this time of the year it's actually quite colourful with all the kind of the different types of wildflowers kind of popping up here and there. So what I'm going to do is maybe try and take some pictures of that instead, and hopefully that will still kind of show what the lens it kind of does in terms of, I guess, the bokeh and the kind of out of focused kind of areas around the edge of the photograph. So let's kind of have a wander around and see if we can find anything interesting. But before that, let's load the camera with some Kodak Gold. The reason why I picked these particular woods was because I was hoping to capture some bluebells, as they're often about between April and May time. Though I've been wandering around for about an hour and a half now, and I haven't been able to see any kind of suggestion of them being about here. Though I'm thinking maybe because it is the end of May, that maybe I've missed my opportunity to get anything. So what I'm going to do, I think, is kind of head back to the car, and if I see anything interesting along the way, I'll capture something. But I have a feeling that I'm maybe going to have to dedicate another weekend to try and kind of test this lens out and show off what it can actually do. During my initial outing, the one thing I did find slightly awkward was the focusing. I guess due to the lens characteristics and the way it renders, I found that the camera I was using did struggle with focus confirmation. So most of the time I just ended up judging it myself through the viewfinder. However, maybe using a camera with a split prism or even a digital camera with focus peaking might actually help with this. I'm not sure if there's an issue with the lens, but for some reason it wouldn't focus to infinity. And another slight niggle is that the closest the lens focuses to is only 1 meter. However, if you're using this for portraits, then those two issues shouldn't really be much of a concern. A couple of weeks had actually passed since my first outing, and while reviewing the first few rolls, there was clearly something missing from them. Portraits. And because the lens is really targeted for that use, I really couldn't make an honest review without including any. So after scouring the internet, I ended up attending an historical reenactment event with groups portraying as Vikings, Saxons, Crusaders, and even the American Civil War. I really like going to these events because more often than not, people don't mind having their portraits made. Though what I also thought might be interesting would be to see if the images that I produce had some kind of vintage quality to them, especially with everyone in period clothing. When I was making portraits and generally using the lens, I found that you really needed a kind of a busy background to help emphasize the swirliness, and having the aperture as wide open as possible also accentuated this. I suppose the one major downside of the lens is that you really have to keep your subject in the center, which kind of can limit your compositions because the focus falls off pretty drastically from the center point, which is what I found out when reviewing some of my photos. Having used the lens now for several weeks, I can definitely say it's been a joy to use, and also a bit of a learning curve for me, as I never really use 80mm on an SLR. Initially, the use of Waterhouse stops seemed like an interesting approach. However, as time went by, this did become more of a gimmick, constantly having to switch them out all the time, and also perish the thought of ever losing any. Thankfully though, this has been updated in the later models. Even though I had trouble focusing from time to time, when I did get it, the images definitely did look sharp. Though I would also be curious to know how the images look on a high resolution sensor, just to kind of see if it kind of captures more detail than it can on film. It's actually quite refreshing seeing a company experimenting with the lenses instead of just seeking design perfection. It's definitely not for everyone, but I would say to at least kind of give it a go at least once, especially if you're someone that enjoys making portraits.